This is an introduction to some of the basic concepts that you need as you begin to read fiction. And they're core concepts that you can apply. I want to begin by making a distinction between fiction and prose. In a sense, they are the same because fiction is made of prose. But fiction has a couple of other things that prose doesn't. So we see here, it's possible to have imagery and symbols and motifs and settings and even characters in actual prose. But one of the core distinctions between prose and fiction, one of the core ingredients of fiction, is that it's got to have a plot. And a plot is usually defined as some kind of conflict. Now, the conflict can be internal, conflict with yourself. It can be conflict with others. But that's essentially what drives plot forward. The other thing that I haven't mentioned on the slide is that plot is also connected to causality. So there's some sense of cause and effect in fiction that you don't really get in prose. To make this a little clearer, I hope, I would say that fiction is written in the medium of prose, but it has these additional features. Finally, we have, when fiction emerged, we have the problem of realism. And it's a tough one to describe. Some authors of fiction make no pretense to present anything real that we would understand in our world. So think of Lord of the Rings, or think of Star Trek, or think of any of those kinds of narratives. There's no way that we would even pretend to claim that that's anything real in a literal sense. However, those imagined stories project deeper realities about human nature, about ourselves, that are real. So even though the setting may not be real, or different parts of the narrative having to do with, I don't know, technologies or other things going on in that particular world, that all of that stuff is real, but it's not literally real. Conversely, you may find some pieces of fiction that are based on, quote unquote, historical events. So, I don't know, a story about the Titanic or a story about Pearl Harbor. And even though they claim to be, quote unquote, realistic or based on real stories, they're not always that way. What I would say, for example, is that many of these stories distort history, distort the real facts of history by adding things or by subtracting things or by enhancing things. And when we come to talk about cinema and visual rhetoric in this course, just make a note of this to yourself because you'll see the same thing. Namely that once we put something into a film, we end up distorting it in some way. So I want you to be uncomfortable with the word realism because it applies to two different ideas. The first is literal realism, that is to say, plot, setting, historically real characters are kind of literal realism. But we can also talk about realism as a deeper sort of metaphorical, psychological realism. Okay, we are working with short stories. And the question is, what is a short story? And the short answer is something that's not too long. And I'm not being facetious. But generally, there are definitions of the short story, usually compressed, minimal characterization, meaning that the narrative really doesn't have a lot of time or words to unpack a particular mindset of a character, what we call the psychological interiority of the character. It can have moments of climax or intensity. This definition, this is taken, by the way, from a dictionary of literary terms. There is one at the back of the Norton text, and you can also buy glossaries of literary terms that try to define these things. somewhere between 500 and 10,000 words. Well, that's huge. I mean, that's a huge variety. But I would say one of the more compelling definitions is this. It's usually focused on a single idea, topic, or theme, and there is no subplot or there is no complexity or nuance. This means by implication that the short story has to be very powerful, short, focused, and very, very dramatic. And again, I just want you to keep this in mind for when we get down to talking about sonnets, and particular sonnet forms. They are very compressed attempts at formulaic expressions of things, and so the writers are very constrained in terms of the limitations of the genre. There's longer forms. Notice that the longer forms don't appear in words, just in pages, a novella. And finally, a full-length novel. I think the easier definition of a full-length novel is something with multiple characters, focusing on characterization and what I call the psychological interiority of characters. For our purposes, a short story is just short, so I'm not going to worry too much about it, but I do want you to know and to be uncomfortable with the fact that there is some critical debate about where a short story ends and where a novella starts, and where a novella ends and where a novel starts. The origins of fiction. Well, the origins of fiction are in prose, and it depends who you talk to. The standard sort of accepted version of who did the first fiction in English is Thomas Nash. A text called The Unfortunate Traveller, 1594. That's contemporary to Shakespeare's early plays in the early 1590s. It is what's called an episodic narrative, that is to say, one damn thing after another. It's a story of a traveler who just goes from one place to another place and has adventures and moves through. There are characters that come in and go out of the story, but there are no sustained characters. There is no psychological depth to the main character of that story. And so it is kind of a Frankenstein, a hybrid. It is prose, but it starts to look like fiction because there are moments when it has a plot, when there are cause and effect relationships between events, when there is conflict between the hero of the piece and other travelers or people involved in the story. So it is not fully born yet, but let's call it embryonic. The main one, probably even more accepted, is Cervantes' Don Quixote. And I know you may be thinking we should be pronouncing it Quixote, but in English departments we pronounce it Quixote. The argument being that we'll never get the Spanish sound properly, so they just anglicize it that way. But, you know, Don Quixote is a chivalric knight wandering through the countryside, chasing windmills and rainbows, and he's an idealist, and he's got a faithful servant. There's some character development, but not a lot of psychological depth. We sort of get a sense of who he is by the things that he keeps saying repeatedly, but there's no sense of an omniscient narrator lifting off the top of his brain and letting us look at what he is experiencing psychologically. The first real novels emerged with Daniel Defoe, pieces of fiction. These are full-length novels, 1719 Robinson Crusoe, 1722 Moll Flanders. Now, I've got a note here that these first novels in English extended Shakespeare's humanism and individualism. And if you remember our talk on humanism, I said that certainly in Shakespeare's time, we get the emergence of the individual in society. And so many of Shakespeare's plays are about individuals: Hamlet, King Lear, Titus Andronicus, Romeo and Juliet, Richard III, Henry IV. The list goes on and on and on. Othello, Lear. These are all psychological explorations of the human mind, and they are, because they are based on a curiosity about how humans work, they are humanist documents. What Defoe does, however, is shift the focus from individual kings and queens to commoners. This is a step again towards what I talked about earlier, this notion of realism. So Moll Flanders is probably one of my favorite early novels. It's a long autobiography. Um, their fiction autobiography. There are no chapters. It just goes on and on and on. She has a series of episodic adventures, which means one after the other, after the other, after the other. Sometimes there's cause and effect between episodes, and sometimes there isn't. Moll sort of inadvertently reveals herself to us over time, but not in any depth. She starts off as a seamstress working in a sweatshop, and very quickly realizes that if she wants to get ahead in life, that menial labor is not the way. And she realizes that what she has between her legs is of value to the marketplace. And so she begins a life as a prostitute. During that time, she ends up marrying multiple husbands who, for one reason or another, come into her life and then go out of her life again. Sometimes they die, sometimes they disappear. This, again, is what I mean by episodic. At one point, she unbeknowingly marries her brother. That's an oopsie. She is eventually caught and put in prison. And for her punishment, instead of being executed, she's sent over to the New World, to America. Robinson Crusoe is about a man who's shipwrecked on an island and takes on a man Friday to help him survive. The thing about both these novels is that they explore the resilience of human will against adversity. One is a man, one is a woman. It's both Defoe's novels are about human ingenuity, persistence, resilience. These kinds of resonances sort of move through the fiction. From there, and so this is a particular kind of realism. By 1764, we have a guy named Horace Walpole who writes a short novel, probably a novella, called The Castle of Otranto, about a ghost who's trapped in the basement of a castle and gets larger and larger and larger and scares all the inhabitants until the whole castle blows up. But this is sort of the origin from prose fiction into what we would call pure fiction, and Daniel Defoe is the transition mark. Recalling our earlier lecture in this course on the problem with genre, there are some subgenres of fiction that you should be aware of. One of them is picaresque. Picaresque is episodic in structure, thin on characterization, usually about the narratives or adventures of a rogue or a commoner. It's basically Moll Flanders and Robinson Crusoe. So these are barely one notch above prose fiction, but you can see them beginning to morph into something that develops with a more fully psychological set of problems. An epistolary novel means one that is written as letters. And I think probably the most famous one was one called Pamela, about a woman who is captured by a nasty man who wants to rape her and imprisons her in a dungeon and holds her prisoner. And she writes about everything. It's a horrible subgenre, really. As she's being dragged off by her hair into the prison cell, she's writing in her diary. And her diary gives us, the whole point about epistolary novels is that we begin to get psychological depth in characters. And really, one of the core features of fiction is psychological depth. And so through her narrative, we come to understand what she feels inside, and we get to compare and contrast that to her outer behaviors or what she does. As it turns out, because she stands by her virtue and refuses, it's kind of weird, but she refuses to permit him to rape her until eventually he has a St. Paul moment where he's knocked off his horse and he has a massive conversion, and he sees that because she's trying to preserve her virginity, she is a good woman, and he does the respectable thing and offers to marry her. What's even stupider is that she agrees. So the endings of these novels are not quite realistic, but Because we're getting psychological depth, you can see more and more how that works. The detective novel is really, as I've got it here, the triumphant blend between science fiction and reason. And the detective novel is more about the human intellect and the human ability to solve problems. So in the case of Sherlock Holmes, for example, we do get quite a bit of psychological interiority, but more importantly, these are psychological studies in how the human mind solves problems. The Gothic is any story that deals with the intrusion of supernatural agents into human existence. And some people put Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as a Gothic novel. It is not. It is science fiction because there is no supernaturalism in that story. So the Gothic must be supernatural. Castle of Otranto is supernatural. John Polidori, 1816, writes The Vampire, the first piece of vampire fiction. So anything to do with zombies, ghosts, witches, vampires tends to be in the Gothic field. And I know that witches are real because Wicca is a religion, but I'm talking about fictive samples where witches are portrayed as supernatural beings. Another subgenre is a Bildungsroman, which is the story of a coming of age of somebody. These are still popular. I've got here James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, but any story that talks about teenagers coming into their own in adulthood and so on. There are so many subgenres, but here's another interesting one. Penny Dreadfuls came out in the 1830s and 1840s. They are, I'd say, roughly contemporary with Shakespeare. And they are stories based on real characters who were actually sitting on death row waiting to be executed. So writers would go and interview these people and ask them about their life of crime and how they came into crime and what horrible things they did as criminals and whether they were repentant or not. And then they would transform that inspirational content that was real into something that was fictional. So I think just to reiterate this notion between fiction and realism, we tend to see them as opposites, right? There's either fact or fiction. But when we talk about fiction as a subgenre, we really mean a kind of curious blend between realism and imagination. Wordsworth talks at one point about what he calls the suspension of disbelief in our reading, where the premise of a story actually permits us to buy into its value. So in something like Lord of the Rings, even though that's a preposterous premise for a narrative, if there's something compelling about the narrative, we will sort of fall in line and believe in it. Anyways, that's Penny Dreadfuls. Here are some of the key elements of fiction, and when you do an analysis of fiction, these are some of the things you need to look for: theme, topic, narrative, imagery, plot, setting, and characterization. These are parameters that you begin to interrogate from one story to the next. And so if I were to say to you, what questions do you use when you interrogate a text, a piece of fiction, you are going to ask yourself, what is the theme? What is the topic? How is the narrative delivered to us? That whole study of narrative is called narratology. Imagery is recurring sets of visual representations that recur through the story. Connected to that, of course, is symbolism, where you've got one particular object representing one particular thing. The plot, as we said, is cause, effect, and conflict, the sequence of events in a story. And we'll unpack this more in a bit. Setting is sometimes important in a story and sometimes not. The Castle of Otranto, the setting is everything because it's a haunted castle. In other cases, the setting doesn't matter. And finally, characterization has to do with how the inner psychology, the inner psychological workings of the characters are offered to us. There are several kinds of narrators: first person, second person, third person, singular and plural. So I said this, you said something, he said something. I know of only one story in the second person narrative. It's a short vampire story whose title escapes me right now, but it's told from a you perspective. And so the way the story unfolds is you wake up in the morning and you notice that you don't feel well, and you look in the mirror and you see somebody else, and you go out and you do this and you do that. And by the end of that particular piece of fiction, the last line says something, you have officially now become a vampire. But that's very rare. It's usually first person singular and third person singular. The plural, we, you, they, not very often in narrative. Narrators can be limited or unlimited. A limited narrator is usually only able to see him or herself. And usually a limited narrator is a character in the story. Sometimes a narrator is not a character, but some other disembodied voice. An unlimited narrator is one who is connected, point 4 there, the omniscient. An unlimited narrator is able to move through time, move through space, see different characters from different points of view. If you recall, when I talked about the epistolary novel, one of the most important things about the epistolary novel is that sometimes you have multiple letter writers in the same narrative. So character A, character B, character C, each one of them writing their own letters. This is what happens in Dracula. And each one of them is a limited narrator. But when you piece all three limited narrators in the same sphere, you start to get a whole picture of what's going on, because you're seeing it through everybody's eyes. Narrators can be said to be reliable or unreliable. A reliable narrator is one that we are basically convinced is telling the truth. Sometimes unreliable narrators will offer us conflicting information. Quite often it's the first person singular. Moll Flanders, for example, tells her story that way, and she often blames other people for her misfortunes, and that's her not intentionally trying to deceive us necessarily, but perhaps even deceiving herself. In any event, an unreliable narrator is one who cannot be trusted. Finally, dramatic and omniscient, very closely connected to limited and unlimited. Omniscient means all-seeing and all-knowing, so an omniscient narrator is almost always unlimited, and a dramatic narrator is limited. You might even want to see those as pretty close to synonyms. Kinds of narratives. Now, this, again, as you begin to interrogate a text, one of the things you want to ask yourself is, how is the plot, how does the narrative unfold? Plots can be said to be linear, meaning A, B, C, D, E. So the plot moves in a straight line with no repetition or no circling back. Iterative it means recursive or circling back on itself. So A plus B, A plus B plus C, B plus C plus D, C plus E plus F. So it keeps kind of adding and building and looping back on itself, and adding and looping back on itself and adding. And those kinds of narratives will often have multiple narrators, where we see the same story told by one narrator and then perhaps by a second narrator, and so on. Circular narratives are ones that start and end more or less in the same place. In the case of Dracula, for example, the beginning of that novel, Jonathan Harker makes a trip into the Transylvanian mountains looking for Dracula. Ends up bringing Dracula back to London inadvertently. All kinds of bad stuff happens. And at the end of that story, Harker and his other colleagues end up chasing Dracula back into the Carpathian Mountains again. So it kind of ends where it starts in terms of setting. It can also end where it starts in terms of characters' insight or things of that nature as well. A teleological narrative is one where nothing makes sense until the end. Teleological really has to do with how things end, and so detective novels are often teleological because it's only when you have all the key pieces of information that you get to understand how it all unfolded. Teleological narratives are the ones that really invite us to keep coming back and to watch over again. It's like watching a movie. The first time you don't really know where it's going to go, but once you know the ending, it's always fun, in my estimation, to go back and watch it a second or third time. Now that you know how things end, you can actually start to look for little clues that are placed along the way. And so teleological narratives are ones that are based on that kind of logic. Retrospective basically means looking backwards on a life. We also talk about time in narratives and plot structure. Analepsis is a flash back in time, and prolepsis is a flash forward or a prophetic vision. So these manipulations of time sometimes symbolize ominous events, fate. Sometimes they help us understand things and so on. This concept from narratives comes from a guy named Wayne Booth. Showing versus telling. There's only two ways for a plot or a narrative to convey information to us. One is by saying the words, "He was a bad man," or by implying it through actions. So the narrative never says he was a bad man. It just shows him trying to drown puppies or, choke birds or whatever it is. And it is implied through action that he is a bad man, but we're not told specifically. For us as critics, this presents not an insurmountable problem, but one that requires extra thinking. If the actual text specifically tells us something about a character, that this was a bad person or this was a good person, that's a direct piece of evidence that you can simply quote from. If, on the other hand, showing, which is a lot more subtle, the plot kind of describes behaviors or actions that a character is undertaking. And in that particular case, we have to paraphrase what we think it implies. And so this is a problem of voice. You can't say that the text says that this person is a bad man. You have to say the text implies it because, and here's where you have to paraphrase and you have to be transparent in your thinking and show your reasoning. I think that this character is a bad man because the text implies that when we see this character do that or do this or say that. So showing and telling is another way to present information. This is interesting, framing or nested narratives. You'll see this sometimes in fiction where you won't see it very often in a short story because it's a structure that requires more time and space to unfold. But narrator A will begin telling a story, and narrator A meets person B, on a campfire on a Wednesday night in the bush, and all of a sudden you've lost character A, and now we're hearing the story of character B as reported to us by character A. So nested or framing narratives are like Chinese boxes, one inside the other. Two other terms, diegetic and non-diegetic. Diegetic means heard or experienced by the characters. Non-diegetic, not heard by the characters, but heard by us. So remember, I was talking about omniscient narrators. You might have, a storyline where a character is headed for tragedy at the end. And the voice of the omniscient narrator speaks to us, saying, character A is headed for disaster. That's an ominous prophecy. That is a non-diegetic. That's the narrator speaking to us, but the character doesn't hear us. On the other hand, if one of the characters in the novel who speaks to the hero says, "You are headed for disaster or tragedy," that's diegetic because the characters inside the fiction basically hear it. Finally, some other notions of narrative structure. Freytag's pyramid there is a whole sequence, exposition, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling. A story doesn't have to follow Freytag's pyramid exactly. It could be missing a falling action or a resolution or a conclusion. It doesn't have to be those sequence of events immediately. It could be a modified version of that. What you may find more important and more useful is erotetic narration. This is from a guy named Noel Carroll. Now, he's talking about horror stories, but it doesn't matter because it applies everywhere. What Carroll says is that some narrative structures have events that appear earlier in a story and that are somehow connected to events that appear later. Now, he's deliberately vague for good reason, because this connection can be expressed in a number of ways. The idea of erotetic narration could be déjà vu. So you have a scene at the beginning of the novel where somebody imagines something, and then later on in the novel or the story, another character experiences kind of the same thing but not, and then further on a third character kind of experiences that but not. You have these earlier scenes that are related to later scenes. Sometimes there's a déjà vu, which is basically a repetition, but the scenes or situations could be incremental. They could be increasingly violent, for example, or increasingly mystical, or increasingly difficult to understand. But it's got to do with relationships between motifs. And this is really what a motif is. It's a recurring concept or notion that appears. So when you think erotetic narration, think motif. Finally, I come to Carl Jung, and if you go back to week 1 when we talk about different kinds of critical approaches, Jung was a psychologist who developed a number of psychological theories based on and drawn from literature. And Jung gives us some language or vocabulary to talk about fiction. So one of the more famous Jungian patterns of a narrative structures is what's called the quest motif. And it's in 5 phases. The hero is part of a community. Sometimes that hero is marginalized in the community, but still basically begins with a community that is whole. The community is then threatened, and there's a hero who steps up to champion the community. Sometimes the hero is reluctant, sometimes not. The hero has to leave his or her community and go into the wilderness, usually alone, occasionally with a companion, but not really. They go into the wilderness on their own, and in the wilderness they are tested. Their different qualities of their personality are tested. For example, honesty or integrity, or physical strength, or resilience. And they get tested in all kinds of ways. And in the testing, they achieve some kind of victory, and they return home a changed and better person. And it's a kind of comic ending in the Shakespearean sense, where when the hero returns home as a changed person, the community is better off too. And just think of Lord of the Rings, because that whole story is a Jungian motif, and we know that Tolkien was a big Jungian. And followed Jungian psychology. And so too with a number of Star Wars notions. I'll talk about that in a minute. But these are, it's not just that the pattern is there and that I'm seeing it there because I'm a critic, but the producers and writers of these stories have actually said explicitly in various places that they were trying to apply the Jungian motif. Finally, some Jungian archetypes. These are recurring characters, says Jung, that occur across literature, across time, across space. and they appear in all kinds of different stories. These are figures. They are, I don't want to say cliches, but they are like a cliche. They are recurring figures that have certain expectations. There's a mother or nurturer figure. A trickster figure is a character who is usually innocuous and not particularly dangerous, but they cause trouble. Child characters, hero characters, a wise woman, devil characters, and so on. For example, in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker has to come into contact with Darth Vader. And Darth Vader, if you know anything about the history of the evolution of the English language, when you run our language through what's called the Great Vowel Change of the 17th century, the TH becomes a K, so Darth becomes dark, and V, which if you think about it is made with your teeth and your lower lip, V and F are exactly the same sound, except one has a vibrating sound and one doesn't. But Darth Vader becomes Dark Father. And another one of the Jungian motifs and archetypes is that every son has to come into conflict with his father and murder his father in order to become a man. So those are some things you can consider when you deal with fiction. I'm going to say one more thing. It's a caveat. It's a serious warning. Write this down so you are always clear. The narrator is not the author. The narrator is not the author. The narrator is not the author. It's possible in some cases that may be the case, but you cannot infer it. You have to start your analysis from a place that says the author stands behind the narrator. And the author is expressing his or her thoughts and voices through a narrator who may or may not be reliable. And so when you are working with fiction, you have to forget the notion that the author matters. The author doesn't matter at all. This is Roland Barthes talking about the death of the author. You can just Google that and you'll see what that means. But he basically argued that we talk about the text and not the author because we never know what the author's intentions were unless the author actually wrote it down. So that's your start. I hope these slides will give you some ideas for how you can begin to interrogate your three fictional texts and begin to move towards an analysis of both of those stories.